Do it. BMishler.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much. Looks like I have about 10 seconds before I'm supposed to finish, so I'll go as fast as I can. I'll need the pointer as well. Okay. Well, it's very nice to be here. I've had a great time. Makes me feel like being back in graduate school, having the chance to learn a bunch of new things. Normally we get sort of focused in on our own particular careers, and it's very nice to be able to step back and look at everything. I would like to have the stage lights down just about all the way, please, if we can. We've got really pretty slides. I want to be sure they show up well. Even lower. I guess Richard yesterday had a couple of animal guys. I'm the token plant guy. I'm going to talk about plants. And I'm trying to make it as interesting as I can. We see a lot of interesting plants right here. But what I want to tell you about is some recent efforts that touch on high-tech enterprises in a couple of different ways, which I'll mention, to reconstruct in our case, the phylogeny of plants, but as part of a larger effort to reconstruct the entire tree of life, which is a very nice metaphor that I want to show you. This is basically what I'm going to do quickly is introduce the green plants, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory of how we reconstruct phylogeny, so-called phylogenetics. It's a new area that's having a lot of impact and will have a lot of impact. I'm just going to give you a really brief picture of what the relationships are. It's too complicated to show in a short talk. And then, because of the nature of this audience, I want to talk about what do we use phylogenetics for. It's very powerfully being combined with genomics at this time, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more about it soon. Okay, green plants, the particular group that I'm going to talk about in particular today. You all know green plants. There are some of them up here on the stage. You've seen a lot of them outside. They're one of the most important lineages of life. They're a big chunk of life, about 500,000 species of the perhaps 10 million or so species that we estimate there are. And they range from small little aquatic algae, some of the green seaweeds you see out along the waterfront here, to mosses and ferns and flowering plants. And one of the things I want to try to do is take you back in time. We've been just out in space on that last excellent presentation. I want to take you back in time on Earth and think of deep history, deep time. Life itself is a little over 3 billion years old, as far as we can tell. The green plants have been going on their own for about 1 billion years, so maybe about 1/3 of the time that life has been around. And I want to show you next. This I borrowed from my colleague Mitch Sogan's webpage. It's at the Marine Biological Laboratories in Woods Hole. He puts these up on the web where you can download them and use. He's a nice artist. This is one current picture of the tree of life. Based on a gene, as Ann pointed out, you can sequence genes from comparable genes from organisms and align them and compare them with each other and build a phylogenetic tree in a way I'll explain in a minute. When you look at this, there's a couple of things you should notice. And you should almost feel the same sort of awe about looking at this as you do at looking at the picture of the galaxy that we just saw, realizing how small and insignificant Earth is and people are. Let me just give you a little guideline to what's going on here. There are 3 big domains of life. The nucleated organisms are here. There are 2 kinds of bacteria, the archaebacteria and the eubacteria. There's a whole smattering of miscellaneous nucleated organisms. And then up here at the top, the colored areas are the multicellular organisms. All the multicellular organisms are up here. And as Richard pointed out at the beginning, one of our discoveries has been that the group traditionally called plants is actually split into several independent lineages. We have the green plants I'm going to be talking about, which are here. If you go down the road to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which I really encourage you to do, you'll see the giant kelp forest with the big brown algae. You'll see some red algae out there in the tide pools. The red algae are in a completely different branch of plants. And the brown algae, the giant kelps, are in yet another group of plants. And then, if you've ever heard of the dinoflagellates, you ever seen a red tide down at the coast where the water turns fluorescent at night and the fish die off? Also the algae that occur inside corals, the endosymbiotic in corals. That group of algae is over here in yet another clade. So the plants have gone all over the place. I want you to notice something else. One recent result of work in other laboratories than mine is the discovery that the fungi really are more closely related to animals than the rest of the plants are. So one analogy I've been using with the newspaper reporters, is that when you eat a salad, you're eating your relatives, okay? But you're more closely related to the mushrooms that are in the salad than you are to the lettuce, okay? And you're more closely related to both the lettuce and the mushrooms than you are to those giant kelps that are out in the bay here. So there's really two big truths you can learn from this. I tell the undergraduates at Berkeley that two of the really big truths that you need to learn in college to be an educated person now, one of them is that all living things are related. That's a very powerful and recent observation based on the kind of comparisons that Anne was mentioning, the fact that everything shares the same genetic code, you can find the same genes in all these organisms. Just think of it. That means that there was once one species which gave rise to all 10 million species that are on Earth today. So here's one of the big truths. We are all related. And I don't just mean all the people on Earth, I mean all the organisms on Earth. We're related literally, not in the John Muir sense of everything's ecologically related to each other, which is a true statement, but in the literal genealogical sense, we really are related to all living things on Earth. It changes your attitude a little bit, or it should. Another thing to notice is that all the multicellular life that you know and love as biodiversity, that's all the animals, the plants, and the fungi, are just a little tiny bit of the tree. Notice if you just pruned all of this off, most of the tree would still be there. So if you got rid of all the multicellular organisms, most of the biodiversity is down in these microbes. Tremendous potential there, a tremendous amount of genetic diversity in the microbes. And as the biotechnology revolution is showing, there's bizarre genes down in these groups which will be useful increasingly and in genetic engineering up in here. So if you drew the human branch to scale, it wouldn't even show up at this level. And maybe you could not even see the difference between humans and bears at this level. There might be a little tiny branch. So this is an enormous amount of biodiversity represented on Earth. So what I want to do now, I'll come back to this right at the end, just to let you sort of think about this picture. Let's just look at this green plant branch, which is about 1 billion years old. We have many questions. The green plants became multicellular all by themselves. They've diversified in many ways of reproducing, including the development of the flower, one of their beautiful structures. They've conquered land. One of the very few groups of organisms that made the movement onto land are the green plants. The only plant group that did that. There's only one major animal group that did it, and we're part of that. But of course, in order for the land animals to have moved onto land, the plants had to have been there first as food. And of relevance to biotechnology, there's a tremendous diversification of chemical contents that has gone on during the radiation of green plants and the other lineages. Now we had some severe impediments. This is where one of the high-tech connections come in. We had, in the early 90s, this very large group with many species, very old. We had the difficulty of trying to get comparable data across all of these diverse lineages. Labs were not very well coordinated. Everybody was working independently. And so we were reinventing the wheel or leaving important things out. And the computer algorithms and both hardware and software were not available to do what we needed to do. So we kind of got organized about 6 years ago, and using particularly the internet and data sharing over the web. We have a website, which if you're interested, you can peek into it. It's got a lot of mostly scientific data on it, but it does have some general news articles and things on it too for the layperson. A group of about 200 scientists from at least 12 different countries, which is growing all the time, pitched in together, developed large matrices of data, shared information, shared DNA, using the web as a vehicle. We made tremendous progress in just the last few years of understanding these relationships. And just as a little plug, we did it with just a little bit of money. We've only had $285,000 from the USDA for the 5 years. we're now looking, which is just the kind of change that falls out of the pockets of the genome grants. But we have been looking for some more money to continue this. We have a couple of large grants into the National Science Foundation now. We might even be looking for some corporate partners. Might be nice. But I know I can't advertise from the stage here, so I won't mention any more about that. Okay. Oops. I think I just went past. Well, there was a great picture. Might get this to go back. There we go. I just want to show you a few of the green plants. This is one of them. This is plant sex, in case it's been a while since you had biology. These are the males, these are the females. But this is a step forward. This alga shows the beginnings of the life cycle that the land plants have. What probably is a model for what the earliest land plant looked like is Coleochaete, which is about the size of a pinhead. It lives on the shores of freshwater streams and lakes. Has attracted a lot of attention in the last few years because it looks like this particular group of algae hanging around today is the sister group, which means the closest relative of all of the land plants. And then in the land plants, you can see liverworts right outside in the planters out here. I was just looking at them. Liverworts are very small, flat-growing organisms that resemble what we see from the fossil record as the very first of the land plants. Mosses, sphagnum moss being one that most people know. I was laughing at Ann's comment about the fly geneticists that get together for fly meetings. Well, I'm the past president of the American Biological and Mycological Society, and we have a group that gets together once a year to talk about mosses, okay? That's got to be even weirder. There's maybe a couple of hundred people in the whole world that care about mosses, but we get together and we have meetings, not quite this high tech, but we have meetings every year to talk about mosses. That's my favorite group. This is another moss. This is growing on the sidewalks outside. These are very old plants, though. These lineages have diverged maybe 500 million years ago from the main line that led to the flowering plants. So they're very old groups that are still hanging around. You've probably seen club mosses before. I know everybody's seen ferns before. You may or may not have seen cycads, which look like palms, but they're actually a naked-seeded plant, so-called gymnosperm. Pine trees and fir trees, everybody's seen. And then, of course, the flowering plants, of which we have some up here. Here's an example. All of these complicated plants that I just showed, that entire lineage of land plants we know for sure is a monophyletic group, is a single, that means it had a single origin and a single species. Again, amazing bottleneck. One species managed to make it onto land and diversify into the hundreds of thousands of species of land plants that we have today. Okay, I just want to step aside and talk about this, the theoretical nature of what we're doing here. I just mentioned the word monophyly. It's a technical term that means a group that includes the ancestor and all the descendants. We're changing biological classification to try to have only monophyletic groups in it. So therefore, the old group plant we wouldn't recognize anymore because it's not a group that shared a single common ancestor. What we use to reconstruct the phylogenies are characteristics that change their state along some particular past lineage from some earlier condition to a later condition. You can think of this mutation. This kind of reconstruction technique would work for reconstructing the history of texts or something where scribes have been copying them and making mistakes. These mistakes that are made along the way, preserved to the present, are what we can use to reconstruct the branching pattern in the past. And DNA has provided us our lots and lots of data. So homology, very generally, when Ann mentioned that all living things have 4 nucleotides in their DNA and share the same genetic code, that's a homology for life. There are homologies at various hierarchically nested levels, flowers, seeds, etc., that you can make these phylogenetic trees from. So if you're interested in some little bit of shared history, let's say between the flowering plants and the mosses, you need to find something which changed its condition along the lineage leading to the ancestor of that group, and these become markers for the presence of that group. Simple to say, but it's very complicated. I just put these up here for fun, just because I wanted to show you some real data kind of things. If you look in the professional literature, you'll see incomprehensible huge trees with thousands of species. It's a very difficult problem. This is another place where high tech comes in. The algorithms that are used to reconstruct these trees were originally developed by the Bell Telephone Laboratories for connecting up telephones to networks. It's, you're trying to draw the shortest network between the points, which are the modern-day species. You're trying to connect those dots together using the shortest path, where shortness is the number of homologies that you have. It's a very difficult programming problem. We're now using supercomputers, and there are many very talented programmers interested in developing algorithms for reconstructing these trees. So there's a couple of real trees I'm not even going to go into, but I just wanted to point out that we now know the green plants are a monophyletic group, means that they had a single common ancestor. The land plants are a monophyletic group. They had a single ancestor. The charophytes, Chara and Coleochaetae, the green algae, are out here, some of them. The marine green algae are over here. One fundamental truth, therefore, being that the plants invaded the land from the freshwater and not the ocean. All the ocean green algae are over in this particular lineage over here. Some of them are floating out in Monterey Bay, the sea lettuce, for example. So we can make many inferences from this that are useful intellectually. I'll get to the practical uses in just a second. But we can look at how multicellularity arose in this group. We can look at how their life histories developed, how they developed their particular reproduction. And in particular of interest to me is how did the plants move on to land? We're learning a lot about desiccation tolerance, identifying genes actually that are going to be used in biotechnology here soon. So let me talk about practical use. The phylogeny gives you a roadmap of biodiversity. As I say, it connects up the dots in the most economical manner, and it serves to summarize everything that's known about organisms. Also, it can be used as a predictive tool. Not only does it summarize everything that is known about organisms, it predicts things that aren't known about organisms. So if you know, for example, that there is some useful chemical in this plant, if I want to find another source for that chemical, I don't just randomly look at any other plant. I want to look at the closest relative of this one. It is the most likely to have that chemical. So it can be actually used in prospecting terms, being widely used for biotechnology sorts of studies. Also, the first thing that a doctor needs to know with a new disease or an agricultural person needs to know with a new weed is what kind of organism is the pest and where does it belong in the tree and how are you going to deal with it. And then even conservation, which I'll just mention very briefly, the phylogenetic information is very useful for that as well. There's so much data being generated. These genome projects are developing data faster than it can even really be understood or put into frameworks. And the history provides one very valuable way of arraying the information to look at. So here illustrates that point I just made. If I have, let's say, freeze tolerance, this is a freeze-tolerant plant and this is a non-freeze-tolerant plant, if I want to compare them to look for the causal gene, I don't want to compare really distantly related plants that are widely separated on the tree because there are many, many changes that could have occurred along here that are unrelated to freezing. I would much rather find a closely related freeze-tolerant plant and a non-freeze-tolerant plant and compare them, and likely the difference between them is going to be very small and the genes involved in, let's say, the freeze tolerance are going to be easier to find. We've talked about biodiversity in several of the talks over these 3 days. I think other speakers have covered the ethical values well and the intellectual values. I want to focus on these two just for a second. Biodiversity is big money in 2 ways. This is why the issue of biodiversity conservation does not fit anywhere on the political spectrum. It's certainly not a leftist issue. If anything, it's probably more of a rightist issue because the ecosystem function, organisms provide trillions of dollars per year in ecosystem value, okay, in order to keep ecosystems functioning. Diverse ecosystems are better than depauperate ones. And as I mentioned, particularly economic values, the prospecting for new genes, new drugs, new useful plants, still more than half of our new pharmaceuticals come from plants. So, since Richard's standing up there, let me just go to my last two slides and tell you what we're going to do in the future. We're continuing to key in on certain key organisms that we want to try to unravel their phylogeny. We're attempting to get larger DNA sequences, ultimately the complete genome, which is this genomics you've heard about. We need to do more comparative genomics, looking at the total genome and comparing them among the plants. And we're finding that the good old-fashioned morphological and anatomical characteristics you can see with electron microscopes are still very useful for unraveling relationships of organisms. Even though we have DNA, we find the morphology is very useful as well. And then in the theory side of things, we have massive improvements still that need to be made in hardware and software. And we're working closely with mathematicians and programmers to develop further these algorithms for doing these complicated analyses. And we're trying to combine genes with the morphology and the fossils, etc. And I just want to come back to the overall tree here and just remind you.
Can you point out the 5 branches?
Okay. Well, there are 3 big branches, all right? These are the 3 big domains. And there are actually 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the main clades or lineages of the crown eukaryotes. This one is only unicellular. So the multicellular clades are this one, that one, that one, and that one. There's only 5 big multicellular clades. Those are organisms that have more than one cell to their body. As I mentioned, they're all very closely related to each other and take up a small fraction of the whole tree. And I just don't want you to forget that we're part of this picture, okay? I also don't want you to forget this tree is not static. It is continuing to branch out and move out into space, particularly with these guys. One of the reasons why medicine is so difficult is because the organisms are still evolving and still branching. So this is not a static tree either. At the tips, it's still growing. And that's it. Thank you.